The night was heavy with the smell of cooking meat and rich wine with spices. It was the kind of wine that made guests laugh too loud and talk too freely. 12 members of the Walton family sat around the big dining table, lifting their glasses to celebrate. They had no idea about the trouble coming from just beyond the kitchen door. But before the evening was over, some would choke and couldn't breathe. Others would die from something bitter that they couldn't see. This is the story of Clara and Mary, twin sisters connected by blood, but they were connected by more than just love. They were connected by a need for justice. The kitchen had always been their space, where they learned how to cook in the shadows of their master's big house. But tonight, that same kitchen would become their fighting ground. Clara stood next to the oven. Her hands moved as she made a feast, one that would soon become a way to get even with the family that had built their money on her suffering. The grandfather clock in the hallway rang 7 times. Each ring was a slow warning of what was coming. The smell of roasted duck mixed with a hint of something darker, something no one at the table could taste yet. Before we get into this story of revenge, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment. And if stories like this light something up inside you, hit subscribe because what you're about to hear has been waiting in silence for far too long. Clara and Mary were born into slavery, into the hard work and sweat of the Mississippi plantation. The sounds of it were carved into their bones like a second skin. The hot sun would beat down on them as they worked in the fields or rushed around in the kitchen. Their lives were controlled by whatever their masters wanted. To the Walton family, they were nothing more than bodies. 2 young girls who could cook, who could clean, and who could be worked until they were exhausted without any questions asked. But Clara and Mary were more than what their jobs made them be. They were more than the walls that trapped them, more than the chains that held their wrists. From the moment they could walk, their bond was made in silence and secrecy. 2 sisters connected by blood and by an understanding that they never spoke about, that their fate would never be their own unless they took it. They grew up in the same room in the slave quarters, tucked away behind the kitchen in the center of the plantation. The quarters were small and rough. The walls were thin and the roof leaked when it rained. The sisters learned early to share everything: food, space, dreams. Their mother, an older woman with a face hardened by years of suffering, had taught them the most important lesson: never show weakness. Never show fear. It would be their only protection in a world that had no mercy for them. By the time they were teenagers, the sisters had become very important to the Walton family. Clara, with her steady hands and natural talent for cooking, was often called to prepare meals in the house. Mary was given the job of cleaning, fixing clothes, and doing the endless chores that kept the plantation running. Both girls were born with a special gift, an amazing ability to learn and copy recipes, to season food perfectly, to make each meal seem like a work of art. In a world that had taken everything else from them, the kitchen was their space, their kingdom in a way. But as the years went by, the sisters began to understand that their cooking talents were their only way to have any power, and that power came with a price. They had seen the way their masters treated them. Judge Walton, the master of the estate, was a man with lots of wealth, power, and pride. He was a man who valued his belongings above everything else, and in his eyes the sisters were no different from the horses he kept in the stable, useful only as long as they served him. Clara and Mary watched as the Walton family lived in luxury. The house was grand with marble floors, gold trim, and fancy fabrics hanging on the walls like some decorated prison. They could hear the laughter of the family and their guests at dinner parties, the clinking of glasses, and the echoes of shallow talk. The world outside the kitchen was a world of too much comfort, of luxury, and it was a world that had no place for them. The Walton family lived like royalty, and their wealth had been built on the backs of people like Clara and Mary. It was on one of these nights, as Clara worked in the kitchen, her fingers skillfully slicing through vegetables for the evening's dinner, that she first saw the true cruelty of their masters. The overseer, a cruel man named Mr. Bryant, had come to the house in a rage. He had just finished whipping one of the field workers for a small mistake and was drunk on power, his fists clenched tight as he entered the house. Without warning, he turned to Clara, who had been setting the table in the next room. "The kitchen is too quiet, girl," he said in a mean voice. "Do you know what happens when the kitchen gets quiet?" Clara lowered her head. The old habit of trying to stay invisible kicked in, but seeing the blood on Mr. Bryant's hands made her stomach turn. She had been warned before about being too visible, too noticeable. But Clara couldn't stay silent this time. "I don't know, sir," she replied quietly. Her voice was steady, showing none of the fear that churned in her stomach. Mr. Bryant sneered again, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know, huh? Well, you better get back to work, or I'll remind you how quick a little fire can start." That night, after the overseer left, Clara couldn't shake the image of the blood-stained shirt that had stuck to his chest. She had seen it too many times, the violence that the masters used on the slaves, not just physically but mentally. It was a constant reminder that they were never safe, never truly free. It didn't matter that they worked without stopping to feed the family, to cook their meals, to keep them comfortable. In the end, they were just tools. As the months passed, the sisters began to feel the weight of the cruelty around them in ways they hadn't before. The master's temper had become worse, and the overseers had grown bolder with their punishments. The fire of fighting back started to burn in Clara and Mary's hearts, and they knew deep down that the only way they would ever be free would be to take back what was rightfully theirs. The days that came after the overseer's angry meeting were filled with a new, quiet tension. It was as if the air itself had gotten thicker, a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on Clara and Mary. They could feel the changes within themselves, the slow, steady shift from quietly accepting things to a quiet kind of fighting back. They had seen the cruelty before, had seen the broken bodies and tired spirits of those around them, but this time something inside them had broken. They could no longer pretend they were helpless. Clara's hands still worked hard in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring pots with the same skill she had learned over the years. She knew how to season the perfect pot roast, how to make a stew that would make Judge Walton's guests sing her praises. But now, every cut of the knife, every stir of the spoon carried with it the weight of a darker purpose. She and Mary had begun to share whispers, those quiet talks in the dead of night when the house had settled into an uneasy silence. They would talk of freedom, of the world beyond the plantation's borders, of the chance that one day they could escape the awful place they had been forced to live in. But Clara had come to realize that freedom could not be handed to them. It was a bitter lesson, one that was hard to accept after so many years of silence. Their mother had taught them to stay quiet, to put up with the violence without complaining. But Clara knew better now. The time for quiet endurance had passed. They could no longer wait for the impossible dream of freedom to fall into their laps. They had to take it. In the evenings, when the family sat around their dinner table, Clara would stand in the kitchen listening to their laughter and talk. The sounds of the Walton family's too much comfort echoed through the walls. Their voices, smooth and polished, spoke of money, of status, of a world they would never let the sisters into. Clara hated them. She hated them for not knowing, for their ease in a world built on the backs of people like her. But it wasn't just the Walton family she hated. It was the system that had taught her and Mary to serve, to smile and nod, to work until their hands bled and their backs broke, all for a family who would never see them as human. That was the true cruelty, the idea that they were just tools to be used and thrown away when the time came. But Clara and Mary were no longer willing to accept this. One evening, as Clara prepared the evening meal, her thoughts drifted back to Ruth, the elderly housekeeper who had long been a silent witness to the suffering on the plantation. Ruth had always been there, her back bent by years of hard work, her hands twisted from the same work the sisters did. Yet despite her age, Ruth had never lost the sharpness of her mind. She had quietly taken Clara and Mary under her wing, teaching them the art of surviving in the shadows, of using their positions to help themselves. It was Ruth who had first shown Clara the old herb book hidden beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, where the Walton family could never find it. Ruth had kept a collection of recipes, not for food but for medicine that could heal wounds or kill. Ruth had taught Clara how to take poison from certain herbs, how to prepare it in a way that wouldn't be noticed by even the most careful eye. It was a lesson that had left Clara both interested and horrified. "This world, child," Ruth had said one day, her voice low and serious. "It will break you if you let it. But sometimes the only way to survive is to fight back. You don't have to be big to make a difference. Sometimes it's the smallest thing that has the biggest impact." Clara's mind had stayed on Ruth's words ever since. The small things. The things no one would notice until it was too late. It was in those small moments, those seemingly unimportant acts, that she saw the key to their survival. It wasn't just about serving meals, about cooking perfect dishes. It was about what those dishes could become. The idea grew slowly like a seed buried deep in the dirt, but the more Clara thought about it, the clearer it became. They could use their position in the kitchen to strike back. They could use the very tools they were given to feed the family to destroy them. Mary, who had always been quieter, had begun to see the potential in Clara's plan. They would start small. They would test it first, see if they could slip something into a dish that would make their masters sick, but not too sick, not enough to make people suspicious right away. The idea wasn't to kill them right away. No, the idea was to make them feel what they had made others feel. Helpless, trapped, weak. The sisters began trying out the herbs Ruth had shown them, testing small amounts of poison in the food they prepared. It was a slow, careful process. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Each evening after the Walton family had finished their meals, Clara and Mary would share a quiet, knowing look. They could feel the tension building. The family was eating the poison, and although the symptoms hadn't been bad, it was only a matter of time before the effects would be felt. The power, for the first time in their lives, was in their hands. The quiet fighting back that had been growing inside Clara for years was beginning to take shape. She no longer feared the masters. She no longer feared the overseers. The fire inside her was growing stronger, and the time to act was getting close. She would not stand by and watch the Walton family live in luxury while her people suffered. She would make them pay for every whip, every lash, every moment of cruelty they had done to the enslaved. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she stirred the pot on the stove. The time was coming, and the sisters had only one chance to get it right. The heat of the Mississippi sun had begun to fade, but the fire inside Clara and Mary had only grown. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of simmering stews and roasting meat, the same smells that had filled the Walton household for years. But tonight it was different. Tonight the kitchen was their safe place, the place where they could speak freely, where they could share their thoughts without fear of being heard. As Clara worked, her hands moving with the practiced skill of years spent preparing meals for the family, Mary sat at the wooden table. Her fingers idly traced the pattern of the wood. The weight of the plan they had set in motion seemed to settle on them both. There was no turning back now. The sisters knew that their act of rebellion would change everything, not just for the Walton family, but for them too. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that could cost them their lives if they failed. They had spent weeks preparing, each night slipping little amounts of poison into the food they prepared, testing the limits of the herbs they had gathered from Ruth's secret book. The first few tries had been small, just enough to make the master and his guests feel slightly sick, to make them uncomfortable without raising suspicion. But now, as they gathered more powerful ingredients, the plan was clear. The entire family would eat a meal that would leave them unable to move, just long enough for the sisters to make their escape. "What if they don't eat tonight?" Mary asked quietly. Her eyes flicked nervously to the window as if expecting someone to walk in. The weight of the plan was beginning to settle on her shoulders too. Clara didn't look up from her work. "They'll eat. They always eat." Her voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it, one that Mary hadn't heard before. The time for hesitation was over. Clara knew what had to be done, and she had no intention of letting fear stand in their way. Mary nodded, though her hand still trembled on the table. "And if it goes wrong, if they catch us?" Clara finally looked up, meeting her sister's eyes. The bond between them was unspoken but couldn't be broken. They had been through everything together, suffered together, survived together, and now they would fight together. "Then we make sure it doesn't. We've been careful, Mary. We've planned every detail. There's no turning back now." Mary swallowed, her throat dry. "But what if—" "There are no what-ifs," Clara cut in, her voice getting harder. "We're doing this for us, for everyone we've lost." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the soft sound of utensils and the simmering sound of food cooking. But beneath the surface, Clara could feel the rising wave of fear and excitement that had been building for days. The fire was almost within their reach, and in that moment, Clara knew they had the power to burn everything down. They had carefully chosen the night for their plan, the night when the Walton family would gather to celebrate Judge Walton's birthday. It was a grand event, one that would be filled with guests and laughter, with wine flowing freely and people so distracted by their own comfort that they wouldn't notice the small shifts happening right under their noses. The perfect night to set their revenge in motion. Ruth had helped with the details. The old woman had been a quiet helper, someone who had seen the cruelty of the Walton family firsthand, and understood the pain that had been done to them for years. Ruth had taught Clara and Mary everything they needed to know: how to prepare the poison, how to hide its taste, how to make it unnoticeable. She had shown them how to slip it into the wine, into the sauces, into the food in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion. It was a delicate process, one that required patience and exactness, but Clara and Mary were ready. "The table will be set just as usual," Clara said. Her hands moved steadily as she prepared the final touches for the meal. "The guests will come. They'll sit. They'll eat. They'll never suspect a thing. And when it happens?" Mary asked. Clara's eyes narrowed, her gaze getting harder. "When it happens, we leave. We make sure we're gone before anyone can figure it out. We can't afford to wait. We'll be free." The sisters worked in silence for a while, the weight of their plan settling over them like a heavy blanket. It was a strange feeling, this mix of dread and excitement. They had never been in control before, never had the power to make such a big choice in their lives. But now they did. They could change everything. They could make the Walton family feel the suffering they had caused for so long, and in the process they would get their freedom, their true freedom. The final dish was ready now. Clara could already picture the dining room, the long polished table, the fine dishes, the guests seated around it, unaware of what was coming. They would eat, they would laugh, and then they would fall silent, one by one, as the poison slowly did its work. Clara looked at her sister, her voice softening for the first time in hours. "Are you ready, Mary?" Mary's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but there was no fear now, only determination. "I'm ready." Clara nodded, turning back to the stove, her hands steady. The night was almost here, and with it the chance to make their mark on the world. This was more than a meal. It was a message. It was justice. And when it was over, the world would never be the same again. The evening had arrived. Clara stood in the kitchen, her back straight and her hands steady, though her heart pounded with the weight of what was about to happen. The Walton household had already begun to fill with laughter and the smell of rich wine as the guests arrived, eager to enjoy the fancy feast that Clara had prepared. She could hear the clinking of glasses from the dining room, the soft murmur of talk, the rustle of silk and fine fabrics brushing against the furniture. Tonight, the world outside the kitchen was alive with the energy of celebration, of privilege, of too much comfort. But here, in the shadows of the kitchen, Clara and Mary were preparing for something different, a celebration of their own, though one that would come with consequences. Clara had spent hours making every dish perfect. The roasted duck, glazed with a sweet wine sauce, had been mixed with just the right amount of poison to make it unnoticeable but deadly. The vegetables, crisp and bright, had been dusted with a fine powder, hidden by the cream sauce they drizzled over them, and the birthday cake, the crowning glory of the evening, had been carefully laced with poison, a sweet, creamy layer that would hide the bitter taste that would soon settle in their mouths. The poison had been chosen for its slow, sneaky effect. Enough to make them unable to move, but not right away. It would take time, a slow descent into helplessness. The Walton family, not knowing about the coming danger, was seated at the grand dining table. Judge Walton, the father, was already holding court, raising his glass in a toast to the occasion. His voice was deep and confident, and his smile was smug, as it always was when he felt in control of the world around him. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him. Her eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a life well lived, one built on the backs of people like Clara and Mary. The guests, the wealthy men and women who had been invited to the birthday celebration, seemed to enjoy the fanciness of the evening. They were a blur of fine dresses and tailored suits. Their laughter rang through the walls as they told stories of their latest successes, of the wealth they had built. Clara could hear them clearly, and she felt an icy calm settle over her as she thought of the years of suffering they had caused. Tonight they would not be so smug. Tonight they would pay. She and Mary had taken care to make sure that their actions would go unnoticed. The plates were served without a problem. The dishes were passed around the table with practiced grace. Every course was met with praise. The guests had no idea that each bite they took would soon make them suffer. Clara could hear them complimenting her work, praising the flavors, commenting on the richness of the sauce, the tenderness of the meat, The compliments seemed to mock her, as if they were unaware that the very food they ate was their undoing. But Clara did not let the praise change her mind. She had one goal now: to see this plan through to its bitter end. As the evening went on, the guests grew louder. The wine flowed freely, their laughter becoming a bit more loud. Judge Walton, especially, was becoming more animated. His cheeks were flushed from the alcohol, his words slurring slightly as he raised his glass for another toast. To family, to success, to wealth that knows no limits, he declared, his voice booming. The guests echoed the words, raising their glasses together, unaware that the toast they were making was the final one they would ever share. Clara stood in the corner of the kitchen, her back against the wall, her eyes scanning the dining room. She had done it. She had fed them their last meal. The air in the room was thick with waiting, and Clara could feel the tension building, the moment of reckoning getting nearer. And then it began. It started with a small cough, almost too quiet to hear, but enough to break the appearance of happiness. One of the guests, Mr. Thompson, a well-dressed businessman who had been sitting across from Judge Walton, shifted in his seat. A frown crossed his face. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, looking confused, and then leaned forward, his hand clutching his stomach. The talk at the table stopped for a moment, but no one took notice. Not yet. It didn't take long for the first signs to appear. Margaret Walton, who had been sipping her wine delicately, suddenly looked pale, her face flushed, her hands trembling as she set the glass down. Her voice was shaky as she asked, "Is there something wrong with the wine?" A wave of concern spread through the guests, but it was too late. The poison had already begun to take hold. Judge Walton, whose own glass had been filled with the same wine, clutched his throat. His voice stopped as he tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him and he fell to the floor with a crash. His body shook, his eyes bulging in horror as the poison slowly paralyzed him, just as Clara had planned. The guests screamed. Some tried to rush to his side. Others stumbled backward in shock, but the damage was done. One by one they began to fall, their bodies racked with pain as the poison went through their veins. The air was filled with the sound of choking, of gasping breaths as the Walton family and their guests gave in to their fate. Clara's heart raced, her pulse quickening as she watched the scene unfold. This was it, the revenge she had longed for. The family that had hurt them, that had broken their spirits and stolen their freedom, was finally paying the price. The justice that had escaped her for so long had arrived, served on a silver platter, but even as she stood there watching the chaos unfold, Clara felt no satisfaction. She had wanted this moment for so long, had planned it with such care. But now that it was happening, she could feel the cold emptiness that came with it. Revenge was never as sweet as it seemed. The fire had been set and it was burning. But Clara knew that the flames would consume them all, and when the fire was gone, there would be nothing left but ashes. The silence that followed the screams was deafening. It spread like a heavy fog, thick and choking, filling the once lively dining room. The sounds of choking, gasping for air, and bodies falling to the floor were replaced by an eerie quiet. The Walton family and their guests were now still, lying across the table and floor, their lives slowly fading away, swallowed by the very feast they had so eagerly eaten. Their laughter, their smugness, their sense of being better than others, all had been put out in an instant. Clara stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her heart hammering in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had done it. She had watched them eat, watched them celebrate, all the while knowing that each bite, each sip, was slowly dragging them toward their end. The sight of them now writhing on the floor in pain was not the victory she had imagined. The satisfaction she thought would come with their suffering was absent, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. But she did not have time to think about the feeling. She could hear the distant sounds of footsteps in the hallway, frantic calls for help, the desperate attempts to revive those who had already stopped breathing. She had planned this night with careful detail, but it had come at a steep cost, one that would not be easily paid. Mary stood beside her, her eyes wide with horror, her hands shaking at her sides. The realization that their actions had led to this moment seemed to hit her all at once. She had been quiet during the meal, too fearful to show her emotions, but now she couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. "What have we done, Clara?" she whispered, her voice cracking with uncertainty. "They're dying." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at her sister, her own face hard and cold. She understood the fear that had taken root in Mary's chest. They had planned for the family to suffer, to feel what they had made others feel. But seeing the destruction happen before them was another matter entirely. They had killed not just the Walton family, but the entire foundation of their lives. The rebellion had come at a steep price. "We did what we had to," Clara replied, her voice low, almost distant. She was trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince Mary. This is what happens when you live in a world built on cruelty and lies. This is what happens when you use people as tools. You reap what you sow. Mary looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. "But they're dead, Clara. We've killed them." Clara's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of her words, the reality of what they had done sinking in. But she also knew that there was no going back. The Walton family had lived above the law for too long, taking everything from them and from the others on the plantation. They had used their wealth and power to bend the world to their will. And now it was over. Their reign was finished. "I know," Clara said softly. "But we don't get to choose how they die. We only get to choose how we live." The silence continued to press down on them as the house grew quieter. The sounds of life faded into the background as the realization of what they had done settled in. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts moving too quickly to catch. She knew they had to leave, now. There was no time to waste. They couldn't stay in the house any longer. The poison had worked, but the aftermath was only beginning. The authorities would be called soon. They would come searching for answers, and they would never stop until they found the ones responsible. Clara quickly moved toward the back door of the kitchen, her movements purposeful, her heart still racing. Mary followed her, still in a daze, but Clara could see the determination beginning to harden in her sister's eyes. It was time. They had prepared for this moment for so long, and now it was here. "We need to go," Clara said, her voice sharp now. No room for hesitation. The longer we stay, the more chance we have of being caught. Mary nodded. But Clara could see that her sister wasn't fully ready to leave behind the life they had known, the life they had shared, even if it had been one of pain and suffering. But Clara was determined. The fire had started, and now they needed to leave before the flames consumed them too. They moved quickly, passing through the kitchen and out into the back hall. The plantation house, once a symbol of their imprisonment, now felt like a tomb. The grand staircase that had once been a place of pride for the Walton family seemed hollow, as if the very walls were mourning the loss of the lives they had built. Clara could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. This place had been built on the backs of her ancestors, and it would be the last time she ever set foot here. Mary followed her silently, her face pale but determined. Clara knew that their escape would not be easy. The Walton family's friends would be after them soon, and there would be no mercy. But it didn't matter now. They had already made their choice. The back door swung open and Clara stepped out into the cool night air. The stars above were bright, but they didn't offer comfort. The world was too big, too uncertain. They had survived one battle, but the war was far from over. "We go south," Clara said. "The river's close. We'll find a boat. After that, we'll get to the Underground Railroad." Mary nodded again, her lips pressed tight, the weight of their choices hanging between them. They had burned the house down, but it was only the beginning. Now they had to burn their past too. Clara didn't look back as they moved into the night. She didn't need to. The fire she had set would burn for them all. It would burn until there was nothing left but freedom. The night was cold as they made their way through the thick woods. The path was barely visible under the cover of darkness. Clara's feet moved with practiced ease, her steps quiet and careful. The crushing weight of the Walton estate had long been left behind, but it still hung in the air, a constant reminder of the price they had paid to escape. The fire had consumed everything, the mansion, the riches, the lives of the family. But Clara knew that their freedom had come at a steep cost. The price of liberty wasn't always clear until it was paid in full, and they would soon learn the full measure of that price. By the time they reached the riverbank, Clara was exhausted. Her muscles ached from the long journey, her body still tense from the events of the night. The sound of rushing water filled the air. drowning out the distant cries and confusion that still echoed in her mind. She didn't know how far the fire had spread or how quickly the authorities would come looking for them. All she knew was that they had to keep moving. Mary, who had been silent for most of the journey, finally spoke. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Clara paused at the river's edge, her eyes scanning the water as she caught her breath. The boat would be here soon. One of the Underground Railroad conductors they had arranged to meet. They couldn't stay on the plantation any longer. Not with the fire still burning in the distance. Not with the Walton family's friends, no doubt, gathering their forces. They would be hunted no matter how far they ran. But that wasn't something Clara had ever allowed herself to think about for long. "We have no choice but to move forward," Clara said softly. "We can't go back." "Not now," Mary nodded, though Clara could see the fear still staying in her eyes. They had survived one battle, but the real journey was just beginning. They were leaving everything behind. Family, home, even the memories of the pain they had suffered. And in return, they had gained something far more precious, freedom. But it wasn't a freedom that came easily, and it wasn't one that would be given without a fight. As the boat came closer, Clara's heart quickened. The familiar face of the conductor, a man she'd never met but had been in contact with through Ruth's network, was a welcome sight in the darkness. He waved them over, his shape a dark figure against the dim moonlight. "Get in quickly," he urged as they got near the shore. "It's not safe here." Clara and Mary climbed into the boat, their hearts pounding as they sat down beside the man. He was quiet as he pushed off from the riverbank, his hands steady on the oars. Clara stared ahead, not looking back at the estate, at the ruins of the Walton family's empire, now nothing more than a pile of ash and smoke in the distance. She had burned that world to the ground, and with it she had set fire to the life she had known. Now they would ride the current toward something new, something unknown. As they moved farther down the river, the mist began to rise, wrapping them in a blanket of fog. The cool, damp air seemed to numb Clara's thoughts as she leaned back against the side of the boat. The rhythm of the oars was steady, and for a moment she allowed herself to drift, to forget about the danger they were still in. It was a short-lived sense of peace, but it was the first she had felt in a long time. "Where are we going?" Mary asked, her voice still colored with uncertainty. "North," Clara said simply. "We'll follow the river as far as we can, then make our way to the nearest safe house. From there we'll move farther north toward freedom." Mary looked down at the water, the soft ripples of the river reflecting the pale light of the moon. "Do you think we'll make it?" Clara didn't answer right away. She couldn't promise Mary anything. Not in a world so filled with danger and uncertainty. All she could do was hold on to the one thing she knew for sure: they had survived. They had burned the past to the ground, and now they had a chance to build something better. They would fight for that chance. They would fight for each other. "We will," Clara said at last, her voice firm. "As long as we keep moving, we will." The boat continued its journey down the river. The sound of the water lapping against the sides of the boat was like the steady beat of a drum. It was the sound of change, the sound of a new beginning. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the freedom they had fought for, the weight of the future that was just beginning to unfold. But even as they drifted toward the unknown, Clara knew that they were not alone. The legacy of the fire, the revenge they had served, would follow them wherever they went. It was a fire that would burn forever, lighting the way for others who were willing to take the same risk, willing to fight for the same freedom. The days that followed their escape were filled with uncertainty. Clara and Mary made their way through the Underground Railroad. Each step brought them closer to the freedom they had dreamed of for so long. But the road was long and the risks were great. There were moments of fear, moments of doubt, but the sisters never stopped moving forward. They had burned their past to the ground, and in doing so they had set themselves on a path toward a new life. Their story spread across the South, whispered in the quarters and kitchens of other plantations, carried by those who heard of the two sisters who had struck back with the most unexpected weapon: food. The fire they had set in the Walton house became a symbol of fighting back, a story passed down from one generation to the next. The legacy of Clara and Mary, the twin sisters of Mississippi, was a flame that could not be put out. Their story did not end with their escape. It lived on, a light for those who dared to fight back against the harsh system that had held them in chains. And though the sisters eventually found their way to freedom, They knew that the fire they had started would continue to burn long after they were gone.